Hey y'all, thanks for joining me today to talk about what's going on. My name is Alex, if you haven't met me already. I'm one of the directors here at Red Ink. I was in Russia until very recently. Obviously things went down there and I had to get out. I was there on a grant from the US State Department, so they essentially said, you could stay if you want, but we're not going to continue to fund you. So at that point I was sort of like, all right, I need to get out because I don't have funding otherwise. A little bit of background about me. I am almost finished writing my dissertation. The dissertation is about this structure here that crosses the Gulf of Finland outside of St. Petersburg. It's called The Complex of Protective Structures to Protect St. Petersburg from Flooding. It's a long title. It's made up of 11 dams, culverts, ship passages, and it's this massive project that the Soviet Union actually began studies on in the 1920s. And so I follow the history of the structure all the way from essentially the beginning of the Soviet Union. And then the structure is finished, it looks like this, by 2011. So it's a good case study to examine the history of the Soviet Union through state building, developed socialism, and then collapse, and you know the resurgence of Putin. And that's what brings me to Russia frequently. I use archives to look at that. I wanted to preface this conversation by saying that I sort of had it in mind to do it a little bit informally, because I understand that what is going on for most of you, if you're here, if you're interested in it, it might be kind of emotional or scary, right? There's a lot of talk in the news about the possibility of World War III or nuclear war. There was a few weeks ago, there was shelling going on around a nuclear power plant. That was pretty frightening, I think, for a lot of people. So what I thought I would do is give some basic arguments from my side of things. See, now it doesn't work. What the heck? From my point of view, and then kind of open this up more for conversation, because I want to hear what you all think, not just about what I have to say, but where your mind is. There's a lot of topics that I can't cover in an hour presentation, so you know I'm not going to get to everything, but I want to hear what you have to say too. So let me see if I can get this to work. Oops, yeah, that works. Okay, so these are going to be my arguments. This is sort of what I'm going to try to prove to you throughout this conversation. The first one is that nationalism, as we all should know, as leftists broadly conceived, is used by the powers that be as a tool to legitimate acts of aggression. And it's happening on both sides, right? We see it happening in Ukraine. We definitely see it happening in Russia, but we also see it here. Russophobia is back stronger than ever, I think, to a certain extent. And only history can teach us how it's used effectively in these ways. The second argument is that what we are witnessing today, what this war is, cumulatively, is a crisis in Western capitalism, in my opinion. Just like the coronavirus was, I think this is also the culmination of 32 years of post-Soviet history reaching sort of a pinnacle. The third argument, there are conflicting material and strategic interests that drive both Russian and Western reactions to what's going on. And we'll talk about those material interests. For now that the crisis has come this far, you know, we're, I think, 3 weeks in, or almost 4 weeks in, there's a perpetual cycle of NATO begetting NATO, this sort of propaganda that NATO is legitimate, is gaining steam again amongst liberals because of what Russia is doing. And at the same time, nationalism begetting nationalism, both in Russia and in Ukraine, and probably in the West too. Any questions about these?
No.
All right. I think, let's see if this works. Hey, it works. Okay. So thesis one. Again, nationalism is a tool that's used by people in power, more or less, to legitimize acts of aggression, right? And they elicit history. If you listened at all to Putin's speech when the war began, it was very historical. He referred to Lenin, he referred to the Soviet Union, he referred to even ancient peoples. So let's get into this conversation about ancient peoples in Russia. This is a map of the old Slavic tribes that existed. We're going to go way back now in order to understand the dynamics that are going on here right now. This is Rurik. Can we turn the lights off here? There we go. This is Rurik. It's a big statue that is in St. Petersburg, and it's also in Veliki Novgorod, which is it's about here. But you can see there's a whole bunch of different ethnicities going on in what is today Russia, Ukraine. And I want you to pay particular attention to this river right here, the Dnieper. It's currently part of Ukraine, right? Ukraine goes like this, goes around. But this river is key to what I'm going to argue tonight. I also did this where I superimposed borders onto the map so you can see today where everything is. So again, pay attention to the Dnieper, the way that it moves. And also, if you've seen maps recently of the Russian position, you know that they're here, around here, and down here, right? Perfectly positioned for eastern Ukraine, which we'll get into why that is important and why that might refute the argument that Russia was unexpected or that not prepared for the war, right? They're still in a great position for what they want. So what I wanted to do in the context of this is to read to you the passage from what's called the Ancient Chronicle, to give you a perspective on what found the state of Russia. They called it Kievan Rus. It extended from here all the way down pretty much, and we'll have a map for it too. But I wanted to read this for you. And I'll try to point out stuff as it said. The Varangians from beyond the sea imposed tribute upon the Chuds, which are here, the Slavs, which are down here, the Marinians, which are here, the Ves, which are here, and the Kravitians, which are actually kind of more like here. But the Khazars, which are down here, imposed it upon the Polinians over here, right? So we're seeing all these different ethnicities having colonial, pretty much, power over lots of different tribes that are quarreling here. The Severians, the Vyachins collected a squirrel skin, a beaver skin from each earth. So they controlled these lands by taking tribute from the peoples that they saw, right? Squirrel skins is sort of, I guess, the tribute of the time. In 1862, the Slavs, the tributaries of the Varangians, which are technically Vikings, it's a Slavic word for a Viking, drove them back beyond the sea, and refusing them further tribute, set out to govern themselves. So the Slavs tried to push out the Vikings and govern themselves here. But there was no law among them, and so tribe fought against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war with one another. The tribes did. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." They accordingly went overseas, across the Gulf of Finland, to the Varangian Roos, the people living in this area. And these particular Varangians were known as Rus, just as some are called Swedes, others are called Normans, Angles, and Goths. That's what they're all named. The Chuds, the Slavs, the Kravitians then said to the people of Rus, "Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule and reign over us." So they invited these Vikings down to what is present-day Russia to rule over them, because they said, we can't do it alone, and we keep fighting each other. They thus selected 3 brothers and their kinfolk, who took with them all of Rus and migrated. The oldest, Rurik, located himself in Novgorod. What happened to that pointer thing? here. Located himself in Novgorod, here. The second, Sinius in Belozero, which is here. And the third, Truvor, in Izborsk, which is around here. And eventually, the two brothers died, and Rurik consolidated what became Kiev and Rus into this principality, right? And if I could, I tried to impose the current day borders over this, but I couldn't. But as you can see, you know, use Crimea as your marker. It goes well over Ukraine. And so, again, you have Vikings that are invited from the north to come and rule over the Slavs, who create this empire, essentially, that stretches all the way into Belarusia, what is current day Ukraine, even Poland. And its center is in Novgorod. St. Petersburg today is here, so very close. And Moscow is here. It's not a principality yet, but for geography's sake. So we already understand that the creation of the first Russian state is multi-ethnic, right? It's made up of all of these different Slavic peoples that are kind of stitched together by a foreign prince, not even Russian. All of that is wiped away when the Mongolians come in the 13th century. This is the Mongolian Empire. It expands all the way to what effectively becomes Austria, taking all of Novgorod and Kiev, the entire thing. So then you have another ethnic component that's introduced into the Slavic world, right? So if you go to Russia today, you'll notice that a lot of people, more than half of the population, are Asiatic. And you can tell that it's not just Europe. And this is partially the reason why. The Mongolian horde invades this entire region. Different Khans break up the empire. And Novgorod, Kiev, and other cities pay tribute to different Mongolian Khans. But at the same time, this is where a lot of historians, particularly in the Cold War, would trace the root of what they called Oriental despotism, because they believed, these old American, mostly historians, argued that it was the Mongol Khan order, that form of government, that autocratic form of government, that would influence Russia throughout history, even into the Soviet period. We know today that that's bullshit, right? It's not true. The Mongolians were present, but their power was not omnipresent, right? It was, you know, every so often you had to go pay tribute, and otherwise you didn't really see the Khan all that much. We're getting to today, trust me. But I think that this context is very important, because in the 16th and 17th century, you have the creation of what's called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it unites the lands of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, parts of Estonia, and parts of Russia. Poland-Lithuania, the Commonwealth, is Catholic, first of all. They use the Latin script, they don't use Cyrillic. And it is on the borders of what was Novgorod, but what becomes the Kingdom of Muscovy, which is also created in the 16th century. Tsar Ivan III proclaims himself Tsar, and Moscow to be the fourth Rome. So again, in these areas, this is the critical part. Again, pay attention to the Dnieper. This is the critical area, because now you have confessional variation in the form of Catholicism and also Protestantism entering what were the Slavic lands, changing what was formerly pretty much homogeneously Orthodox Christian, right? So now we know Poland is Roman Catholic, everything west in Ukraine is Roman Catholic, Belarus is still Orthodox, and these are mostly Lithuanian actually, because they're descendants of Germans. So the whole area never has been Russian, right? And there's even debate over whether or not this area has ever been Russian, because we've already went so far back in the history and found all these different ethnicities that existed. Any questions so far? We're getting to today, trust me. But I do think that this establishing this multi-ethnic composition of what we consider to be Russia, Ukraine, and this whole area is very important. Then you finally get the Russian Empire, which I'm sure if you've ever read Lenin before, you probably know exactly what the Russian Empire was, right? It was a colonial empire. We don't consider it, people in the Cold War didn't consider them a colonial empire because they didn't have colonies overseas. But in fact, as this map shows, not only does each color denote a different period of imperial expansion, but also the ethnic diversity that becomes Russia, the Russian Empire. In the Caucasus here, Georgia in particular, which becomes important when we get to today. Kiev is the third biggest city in the Russian Empire. It becomes after St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, and then parts of what were formerly Poland and Lithuania. Not even to mention what is east. So, Putin said in his speech that Lenin created Ukraine. Ethnically, there's no basis for that, right? Because now we understand that, ethnically speaking, Ukraine has always been different than Russia by proximity of where it's been in relation to Poland, Lithuania, to the Mongols, and to the competing Moscow Empire. But we did get, what he was referring to in specific was nationalities policy under the Soviet Union. The whole idea of nationalities policy under the Soviet Union was to give the ethnic peoples of the former empire national autonomy, more or less, to give them the opportunity to choose to be part of the Union, to form their own Soviet Socialist Republic that would become part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That's why you get Kazakhstan becomes its own Socialist Republic, Ukraine becomes its own Socialist Republic, different countries, Georgia becomes its own Socialist Republic, and so on and so forth. And even members of Russia that are still a part of Russia, like Tatarstan, which is here. The Republic of Tatarstan is its own thing. Udmurtia is another one that is still technically part of Russia. It's here. That's Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan. Udmurtia is down here. These are all republics that are still part of Russia that are ethnically different than Russia. That's important to keep in mind. So, no, Lenin did not create Ukraine. Lenin recognized that Ukraine has ethnic, national, religious difference than Russia and gave them the opportunity to form their own socialist republic and to become part of the Union of Socialist Republics. In practice, though, Soviet nationalities policy reverted back to what became known as Russian chauvinism, which is, as the former imperial power, you can say you have a right to have your own republic, but ultimately the authority to make that decision still rests with you, right? So you are still de facto the power because you're delegating the permission out. Particularly under Brezhnev in the late 60s and the 70s, Russians come to dominate all of the high levels of the Soviet Union. And the government and the party, two different entities which a lot of people don't really understand because it's complicated. The state, the party, and government are three different entities in the Soviet Union that are related, but still different. So as you can imagine, this along with Western agitation and propaganda in the 80s easily ignites into nationalist movements, particularly in the Baltic states, in Central Asia. I think Uzbekistan is one of the first to declare independence from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union disintegrates. Disintegrates by what one historian, Reginald Suney, called the revenge of the past, right? You're giving all of these republics the autonomy to choose, and so ultimately in the future you're digging your own grave, because once they're armed with that bourgeois nationalism that I talked about in the beginning, once they have an idea that we can have our own state, they can declare independence from the Soviet Union and back out of it, and that's essentially what happened. So we're getting to today. Now we're at 1990, right? We're all the way there. We'll get to the second part of the second thesis. What we're witnessing today is the culmination of a crisis in Western capitalism from the past 32 years, from this point of break, I would say. This is a map of Russian oil and natural gas pipelines. This is very important. This is Ukraine. You can see the outlines of the states here. You can see how many of these pipelines go through Ukraine. Belarus, of course. Georgia, in particular, a major one, entering Russia into the Middle Eastern oil market. But these are the important ones because this is what supplies Germany, supplies most of Italy, and Poland. And all this oil and natural gas comes from far away. Most of this infrastructure is built in the 1980s because in the 1970s the Soviet Union experienced a crisis, and the crisis was the oil crisis that also hit the United States and the OPEC countries. Because of that, in order to avoid that kind of crisis, Gorbachev and his crew set up a massive initiative to build oil and gas infrastructure to supply Europe and to get it to the Black Sea. And remember, this is part of the Soviet Union. This is during the Soviet Union, so this entire area, and sort of Poland, is a part of the Soviet Union. And nobody in the Soviet Union in 1980 thought that the Soviet Union would ever collapse, right? You can't foresee that. It just sort of happened. So all these pipelines are built into the expectation that the Soviet Union is forever. It's not forever. This is a map of ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, just to give you a picture of how many ethnicities there are in the Soviet Union. You can see Ukraine here, Ukrainian. This is probably based on language more than anything else. It's an extremely multi-ethnic state. At the same time, in the Soviet period, you have the creation of the European Union in 1951 through the European Coal and Steel Community, right? This is the effort on Europe's part to try to avoid a crisis like World War II by binding all of the countries of Western Europe into economic ties, right? The expectation that Germany and France have at the time is that if you tie all of Europe economically, then it's under no one's interest to start a war, right? Because you're depending on each other for steel, for coal, and for other resources. I guess not really seeing that this would happen, a few years later. The European Union is also, NATO is also created in 1949. And NATO at this time, the early creation of it, is a military alliance to contain the Soviet Union ideologically and also in terms of its influence abroad. So not just in Europe, not just Poland and Hungary, but also in East Asia, in Africa, and in South America. It's very sort of ideologically driven, right? We want to contain communism, we don't want it to break out, but it's also materially driven, right? We don't want Soviet economic policies getting too much traction in the, quote, developing world. But after 1990, when the Soviet Union collapses, NATO's role becomes increasingly to protect global energy rather than to contain the Soviet Union. Because of this, right? Because it understands that these pipelines and these oil fields that are going into Western Europe are so sensitive, and they're coming from what is the former Soviet Union, that there has to be some kind of collective agreement to protect this from continuing, because it is Germany's mostly #1 source of oil and natural gas. So NATO is created to protect the economic order that neoliberals set up in the 1980s and the 1990s. That's what the purpose of NATO becomes. Nothing more. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Russia is privatizing, which is also a part of where we are today. When the Soviet Union collapses, there's many consequences for that. not just the creation of 15 different states that come out of it, but also privatization of state industries. This is essentially Russian companies, Soviet companies, dishing out bonds of ownership to various people. And in some instances, they would give average Russians bonds which symbolized ownership, pretty much a stock in a company. But because the state of the Russian economy in 1990 was so bad, these people treated them like trash, right? They would just say, oh, I can buy a pack of cigarettes for my bond, here you go. And they would trade it. So you can imagine that these bonds get accumulated by certain peoples, right? You can imagine, again, the bonds as stock. There's deals to work out Soviet infrastructure across the newly independent states. So again, think of Crimea. Russia needs to work out a deal with Ukraine to continue access to these pipelines, to continue access to the Black Sea so that they can move out of the Black Sea, but also deals with Belarus and the Baltic states as well. It needs to control access to these pipelines. It's vital for the Russian state to do that. And of course, as I said, NATO's role as a defender of liberalism in Europe, defender of the liberal order in Europe switches to now we are defenders of our resources. We're all fossil fuel dependent. I don't have to go over Yeltsin's presidency. I think that it's pretty well known that he kind of was a puppet for the West. He was the person that sat back as Soviet industries were privatized and bonded out to people, and he was mostly drunk all the time, which, you know. But it is important, in my opinion, that Putin is more or less appointed by Yeltsin as the successor, because what that implies is that Putin himself is a product of the West, right? By sanctioning Yeltsin, putting Yeltsin in power, giving him the power that the West did, and then Yeltsin appointing Putin, Yeltsin figured this is the guy to continue what I'm doing, what Russia is doing, so let's put him in power. Putin becomes president in 1999 to 2000. This is his first period. And at first he starts showing willingness to work with the West, to work with NATO. So for example, he liquidates the holdings of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which is a major oligarch in the 1990s. He seizes his assets and auctions them off. You know, mostly, as we'll get into, Putin's friends buy the shares that Khodorkovsky had. And he signals that the Kremlin is willing to work with the Bush administration, not only with joining NATO, but also in supplying Europe increasingly with the natural gas and oil that they need. This Bush 2001 withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty and the expansion of NATO is one of those periods in Putin's early years that is obviously a big threat, right? Because it incorporates all of this on Russia's border into NATO. But again, Putin is still willing to try to work with NATO and get them to at least stop expanding or stop threatening the Russian border, which is important to keep in mind that, you know, in the United States, we sit here comfortably in North America with friendly borders on both sides. But can you imagine being the leader of Russia, being threatened by this increasingly expanding power? And this isn't being apologetic for Putin. We'll get into the problems with Putin, but you have to understand it on both sides. And Germany, in particular, brokers many deals with the early Putin regime to supply natural gas and oil, increasing those locks, those ties that are supposed to bind Europe and avoid a future catastrophe like World War II. And it gets to the point where by 1970, Europe's total imports from Russia amount to 60%, which is huge. And that effectively makes Russia second only to Saudi Arabia in terms of a petrol state. Russia is the second biggest petrol state in the world, and that's very important to keep in mind. And this demonstrates why. This is a map of the oil and natural gas deposits in Europe. Germany doesn't want to develop its deposits. It's sort of like the United States. It has a lot of areas that could be developed, but it doesn't want to because it recognizes the problems. I know that this map is a little blurry, but you can still see Crimea. You can see Georgia, right? All of these areas east of the Dnieper, where Putin's forces are all here. Major areas, major points of natural resource deposits. And if you're thinking like Putin, the second biggest petrol state in the world, the last thing you want is these deposits getting into the hands of Europe, right? By 2008, Putin splits from the West. Actually, 2007, he gives this actually kind of badass speech in Munich, where he denounces American hegemony. He challenges American hegemony for the first time because he already feels like, because of NATO expansion, he's being kicked out of negotiations of any reconciliation with the West, mostly pushed by the United States, who, again, are threatened by this. The United States is threatened by this as well, the development of Russia's petrol state. The UK grants asylum to a few major opponents of the Kremlin, and that's not good if you're trying to make friends with the West or with Russia. And then in 2008, Russia invades Georgia, supposedly to protect South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And then they sort of do the same thing that they just did. They recognize the two breakaway states, while the rest of the world doesn't. And Russia's war in Georgia is a lot quicker than what we're seeing right now. Georgia is also smaller. But again, keep in mind, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are right here. Vital points of resources for the Russian petrol state. Uh-oh, the text isn't there. No, it's all right, I don't need it. Lenin will help you. This slide is supposed to be about the Orange Revolution that happens in 2004. This person named Viktor Yanukovych is nominated as president of Ukraine, and Ukrainians hate that because Yanukovych is pro-Russian, and Ukrainians cry out that this is fraud. It can't be real. There's no way that Ukraine could have nominated a pro-Russian candidate like Yanukovych, but Yanukovych becomes president nevertheless. There's not much that he can do. And there's a popular uprising against him that is mostly derived from Yanukovych's unwillingness to deal with the West. So because he's pro-Russian, he steps back from negotiations with the EU, and Ukrainians don't like that. And it's really important to keep in mind that these protests, while there certainly is a variety of political ideologies that are moving here, it is a popular protest. People did not like Yanukovych, especially in Kiev, which is ethnically Ukrainian. So in 2014, there's a deal that Yanukovych is supposed to sign with the European Union, bringing Ukraine into more or less partnership with the European Union, and he refuses it. He says, no, I'm not going to sign it. And Ukrainians are pissed about that, because Ukrainians really wanted to, especially in Kiev, enter the European Union in a legitimate way. At least in Western Ukraine, it was popular. And there's a Euromaidan protest in 2014. Massive protest, extremely violent in some instances. But Yanukovych is overthrown. He flees and disappears for a long time and reappears in Russia, coincidentally, a few months later. Russia considers the entire revolution, which is a popular revolution, to be illegal. They don't recognize the interim government. And this is impetus for them to invade Crimea. Right. If we could go back to the map of ethnicities, you'd see that linguistically speaking, Crimea is predominantly Russian speaking, as opposed to Ukrainian speaking, but at the same time, Crimea is not ethnically Russian in the terms of ethnicity, right? Crimean Tatars are sort of their own ethnicity. There's other various ethnicities that are mixed in there. So we'll get into more about the legitimacy of that claim and the delegitimacy of that claim. Finally, after the interim government runs its course, Ukraine has a new election, and they nominate this person, Petro Poroshenko, who's an avid anti-Russian president. He does not like Russia at all. He initiates this process of what he called decommunization, and he creates these laws that are Ukrainian nationalism, effectively, making it mandatory that people know Ukrainian. Ukrainian as the language becomes the state language, and he also sanctions the split of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Russian Orthodox affiliate church, which is the leader of the Slavic Orthodox world. So breaking from that church is a big deal. And you can imagine the patriarch in Moscow yelling at Putin like, "What the heck? You just got rid of one of our peoples, blah blah blah." We know that in 2014 the United States does play a major influence in pushing along these protests, especially the more liberals that are involved in the protests. And we also do know that the majority of protesters in Euromaidan are liberal affiliated. They're not communists, it's not anarchists, it's not even ultra-rightists, other than in the southeast. It is primarily liberals, which is how, I guess, Poroshenko becomes nominated. Poroshenko goes ahead and he signs that agreement that Yanukovych refused to, the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement in 2014. And again, as I said, this kicks off protests in the southeast, leads to the invasion of Crimea and the recognition of the breakaway states in Donetsk and Luhansk. And it's really important that this war, this whole thing, whole invasion of these areas, it never ended. There were 2 agreements for a ceasefire, but as anybody down there will tell you, the combatants never stopped firing at each other. Right? There's small skirmishes along the border from 2014 all the way until Putin's declaration of war a few weeks ago, where things just amped up. This is a depiction of these supposed anti-Russian laws that I think is really interesting. This is a map of the linguistic breakdown of Ukraine, red being Russian. The red areas speak primarily Russian. And you can see majority of the country does speak Ukrainian, but these vital areas do speak Russian. And so according to the Russian state, you speak Russian, you are Russian, so we're going to protect you. And I wanted to pair this with the 2010 election where Yanukovych wins. He beats Yulia Tymoshenko, who is kind of a populist candidate. But you can see literally the political breakdown of this map, right? Yanukovych wins the south area. Remember, he's the pro-Russian candidate who was overthrown in Maidan. And he wins by a landslide these Russian areas, but he loses this whole western part of Ukraine, which again, speak Ukrainian and not Russian. So there is some, if you want to define nationalism based on language, then I guess there is some legitimacy that they are ethnic Russians here. But, you know, definitions of national, what it means to be a national, are fluid. That brings us right up to the election of Zelinski, 2019. And I'm not sure what you heard about Zelinski, but as you can tell from this map, he crushes Poroshenko at the polls. Absolutely destroys him. Even in these eastern areas. The green is obviously Zelinski. Surprisingly, he loses Lviv. And Zelinski wins primarily because he runs on this platform of promising to rid Ukraine of corruption, promising to put a cap on the control of oligarchs in Ukraine and in Ukrainian areas. Does he do that when he becomes president? Of course not, because they never do. Especially Zelinski, who is just really a populist, and we're really seeing him take that role during this war right now. And importantly, Zelinski shows signs of wanting to integrate with the EU, especially after the European Union makes these major investments in Ukraine, 190 million euro payment to support Ukraine's fight against coronavirus, 330 million euros to modernize Ukrainian utilities, gas and oil. So it's a big deal. In Europe, and Russia does not like that at all. So it gives us this question: why is there war? To put it really simply, Russia's geopolitical and economic strengths, it is oil and gas, it is a petrol state, is threatened by Ukrainian membership in NATO or the EU, because it puts the valuable territory and its resources into the European sphere of influence, offering Europe an alternative to Russian oil and gas dependence, right? If Europe can get their hands on those oil and gas deposits, then maybe they don't need Russia so much. This would give Western oil companies like Shell, who have already expressed interest in developing Ukrainian resource infrastructure, building the big oil rigs and everything. This would give Western oil companies a license to develop Ukrainian oil and gas, and Russian oligarchs fucking hate that idea, right? Because they are the people that are funding Russian oil and gas. And of course, you gotta keep in mind, Putin does legitimately believe that he's protecting ethnic Russians. This isn't to say that Putin has lost his mind. I don't think that he has, but he has his own views of history and what it means to be Russian that he's defending. And that leads us to the national conflicts that I'm sure you all have heard about, kind of epitomized by the Azov Battalion, this neo-Nazi group that formed in 2014 around the Maidan protests this is the Azov Sea, this is the Black Sea, if you don't know. Crimea is here. Mariupol is their strong point, which is currently, right now, one of the places that is just being bombed to shreds by Russia. And it's important also to note that the United States Congress did pass in 2018 a provision that would block military aid from the Azov Battalion on the grounds of its white supremacist ideology. But, you know, once the weapons get to Ukraine, what happens to them sort of outside of what the U.S. is capable of? So, do these guys have American weapons? It's very likely that they do. Were they handed the weapons by Americans themselves? Not necessarily. And it's important to point out, as well, there's a lot of talk in Russian media that Ukrainians are neo-Nazis and we're denazifying Ukraine. The majority of Ukrainians are not Nazis. They're just working class people that want to exist. The existence of the Azov Battalion, while it is frightening to a certain extent, it doesn't mean that all of Ukraine is a Nazi state. Although, as I said in the beginning of this presentation, nationalism is begetting nationalism, right? This whole entire war is making the claims of these guys a lot stronger, the anti-Russian claims of these guys. So we have this quote that Olaf Scholz said in the beginning of the war that I think sums up what I'm trying to say about European economic integration and the situation that we're in now. He says, "We've experienced a break in everything we've known until now. In attacking Ukraine, Putin doesn't just want to eradicate a country from the world map. He is destroying European security structure that we have had since the final act of Helsinki for nearly half a century." Essentially saying, Putin is destroying these economic ties that we have sewed Europe together with, that we thought would avoid a war. It's proving that these tyings of European economies isn't working to the extent that Europeans thought that it would. In other words, neoliberalism is failing in Europe. So, thesis 3. There are conflicting material interests that drive Russian and Western actions that we're seeing. I pointed out some of them, right? Oil and gas dispute is huge. There's also, let me try to go back and explain this to you too. There's also simple strategic interest on the part of Russia. So as Americans, we tend to take this perspective, but put yourself over here for a minute. And if you're Russia and you're threatened, you feel threatened by Europe, you don't want this whole area to be open to invasion. You want to narrow the possibility of invasion by narrowing the point of entry of Europeans and European incursion. So even from a strategic perspective, it's in Russia's interest to at least control the eastern part of the Dnieper River, which goes all the way up. That's why I think that that river is a key to this whole thing. Let's see, where were we? So I asked the question, what's the solution, right? How do we stop this then? If we're at a point where strategic material interests, ideological interests even, are conflicting with each other, and there seems no hope. So what's the solution? The one proposed by the United States and its allies has to do with Russian oligarchs, which I'm sure you've all heard so much about. And there's sort of two phases of the creation of Russian oligarchs. There's privatization in the 1990s, which essentially is what I told you. There's 12 major mining companies are transferred from government control, as they were in the Soviet Union, into individuals, privatized in exchange for loans intended to finance the federal budget of the new Russian Federation. The government, in its turn under Yeltsin, deliberately defaults on those loans, allowing its creditors, in other words the oligarchs, to auction stakes in these giant, formerly state companies out. And they get immensely rich from this process. And then there's the second wave of the creation of oligarchs. A lot of these people that are created, Putin actually goes after as a sign that I'm fighting corruption, but in fact what he does is he replaces one group of oligarchs with another. Second wave, where private companies and infrastructure, things like defense and healthcare, charge the government much higher than market prices by offering bribes to relevant government officials. So as we'll see in the next slide, there's certain key oligarchs that are in control of all of these sectors. And this effectively put Putin in the lead of the oligarchs. So while formally in this process, Yeltsin was kind of the stooge of the oligarchs as he privatized and people got immensely rich. By the middle of Putin's presidency, the first term, Putin has flipped the switch on them, right? He demonstrated to the oligarchs that if you fuck with me like Mikhail Khodorkovsky did, I will fuck with you back. I will liquidate everything you have and I will dish it out to my friends. And that's what Putin does in the second term. So by then, Putin is in power. These are the major oligarchs of Russia. These are what they're invested in. And there's three types. There's Putin's friends. These people have been mostly the victims of Western sanctions so far, because there's no mystery that they are Putin's friends. There's the head of Russian security services. It's not just Igor Sechin, but there's more that are involved in this. But he's sort of the major funder of the military and the police in Russia. And then there's outsiders with no personal ties to Putin. These are people like Roman Abramovich, for example, who owns the football team Chelsea. I think he just recently sold it. But he also has very deep investments in Evraz PLC Steel, which is developing pipelines in Western Canada, Calgary and Edmonton, oil and natural gas as well. All these people, although they're not personally tied to Putin, they are Russians, are heavily invested in Western oil and gas. Of note, Deribska denounced the war, but he's sort of untouchable anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now, if the United States or if the West put sanctions on all of these people, would it hurt Russia? And would it be in their interest to put sanctions on all these people? Not necessarily. And this is just a tertiary look of all of the major investments of Russian oligarchs, right? In 2014, 9.4 million to Marine Le Pen in France, right? That's a debt that the National Party in France owes to Russian oligarchs. Lukoil, which is a major oil company in Russia, has its hands in Czech politics. Concord Management in New York is used to invest millions into U.S. hedge funds, right? And Concord Management is owned by, it's pretty much a shell company for Russian oligarchs to funnel their money into to legitimate it. And then, as I said, heavy investments in Canadian oil, which is why, I think a few days ago, the Russian Duma said that they would never allow Justin Trudeau, one of them said that they would never allow the other one on their territory, but it really doesn't fucking matter because Putin doesn't need to go to Canada, right? There's Russian oligarchs already invested in Canadian oil and gas. It's building the infrastructure for it. So can pressure on the oligarchs actually stop this war? My answer is no. First of all, oligarchs don't work well together, right? They're billionaires, they all hate each other, and their only modus operandi is to survive in Russia, to keep their assets that are not just held in Russia, but they're held throughout Europe and the Middle East and other places as well. Not just in the form of giant yachts and residential complexes in Europe, but also massive bank accounts that are invested deeply into other states. So, no, in that sense. The Kremlin has also promised support to these oligarchs that if they're hit by these sanctions, the state will bail them out. So that gets rid of that, especially for Putin's friends. And as long as Putin retains control over the security forces, other oligarchs remain hostages to the regime. So even if there are a few oligarchs in Russia that are against the war, they can't really voice it. And if you heard, there was a speech a few days ago by Putin that essentially brought back the idea of a fifth column. The fifth column is spies, right? It was a word that was used a lot during the Soviet period to out spies and people suspected of being against the regime. Putin revived that word and said there are a lot of people who are from Russia, and maybe they have some holdings in Russia, but they don't live in Russia and they don't know what we're going through here. And so he had sort of implied that we're going to liquidate those people. Not as in kill, but as in take all their assets for the Russian state. So, where is the hope in all this? Is the Russian anti-war movement, the supposed anti-war movement, the hope in all this? Can the West pressure Russian civil society to rise and overthrow Putin? Well, according to a recent poll, 71% of Russians support the war in Ukraine. Now, that poll is definitely inflated. It's definitely not 71%, but it's at least 50. It's 50-50. And the split is mostly over generational lines. So a lot of my friends and colleagues have gotten into fights with their parents and their grandparents, just like we all did when Trump became president, right? Split families, and it's very divided in Russian society. Russia has blocked Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media outlets. It created its own Instagram called Rusgram. Of course, nobody that I know actually uses that because they know that it's just a propaganda tool. The Russian security forces have also been stopping people on the street and seizing their phone and going through their messages. So, you know, I have friends who every day have to delete all of their messages when they you know, have any conversation about the state. But, you know, Russians are resourceful, so they've been resorting to VPNs. 3 members of Russia's Communist Party have voiced opposition to the war, even though in the initial stages they supported the recognition of the 2 republics. So, you know, the Russian Communist Party isn't totally excused from being a part of this. 3 members is not a lot of opposition. It's barely a percentage. As of March 14th, almost 15,000 Russians have been arrested or detained. Some of my friends, these people are just picked up from protests, brought to a detainment center where they have to wait for long hours to be seen by somebody. And then once they're seen, they're sort of let out. And then, you know, my friends go right back to the protest when they're let out because that's what they do. And Oman the special purpose military unit, which is essentially a riot police in Russia. So the people that you see in videos of protests beating people with batons, it's not the Russian police. Those are the Oman forces who are directly under the thumb of Putin. So they have no incentive whatsoever to not beat Russians or to support any anti-war movement. So that's a lot of information to throw at you all. We went all the way back to ancient Rus and looked at the ethnic breakdown of Russia and Ukraine, right? We focused on the Dnieper River. We talked about NATO and the European Union. So the question is, how should we understand what's going on? Because what we as Americans see right now, it's hard for us to consider Russia's actions to be imperialist, because we know that NATO and the European Union have been very aggressively imperialist in the past 32 years in Russia, and trying to expand the borders of NATO and trying to seize those resources, or have at least control over them. So, you know, all sides seem imperialist to us, right? Hopefully. And they are. All sides are imperialist. There's no good guy here. But I think as Americans, and this is a quote I put from Lenin, let us recall also the words that the communists support every revolutionary movement against the existing system. And that means that as Americans, it's our responsibility to resist American imperialism when we see it, because this is our country ultimately. So funding, sending military equipment, putting boots on the ground, all these sanctions are forms of American involvement into this crisis, that it is our duty to call them out as forms of American imperialism. That's my take. It's also important to remember that this is a conflict of global resources, and as long as the world is so tied to the economy of fossil fuel, these kind of conflicts are just going to continue, just going to ramp up. You know, as I consider myself an environmental historian, and I don't think that any environmental historians, not even of Russia, considered that the first crisis would happen in Ukraine. We all thought it would happen in India and China, or elsewhere. Most definitions of imperialism, even Lenin's definition of imperialism, in this case, Russia is an imperialist power, right? So when we have these conversations, we have to work out, okay, what is our definition of imperialism? It's not what Merriam-Webster says. It's not what the first Google response is. There are complicated definitions. Lenin's definition has a lot to do with finance capital. In this instance, I think both powers are extremely imperialistic here. Again, it's a conflict of material and strategic interests over the eastern part of Ukraine, the eastern side of the Dnieper River. This also demonstrates that liberals are willing to ally with fascists in order to push external threats. You don't see a lot of liberals in the United States denouncing the Azov Battalion, because the Azov Battalion is actually helping the Ukrainian government to push Russia out, right? So we have to be critical of when liberals are willing to work with these groups, because all it does is empower them. The real victims of the crisis on both sides are working class Ukrainians and Russians, which, like the United States, are victims of this nationally motivated capitalism competing for resources and hegemony. And if we're going to consider this as a moment in which a multipolar world is being created, I think that this competition for resources and hegemony is very important. And then finally, this great man narrative that liberals have been pushing, that Putin has lost his mind, is completely bogus. Putin has been making these arguments for a very long time. He's been warning, but he's been poked by European Union and NATO long enough. And what it amounts to when they say that, oh, Putin has lost his mind, is that these liberals are incapable of admitting their own culpability for what's going on, right? And again, this isn't Putin apologism. I'm not a Putin supporter, but it does suggest that there's culpability on all sides here, right? And this is why it's increasingly impossible to broker a peace agreement. Neither side is recognizing their fault. Russia's not recognizing their fault. Europe is not recognizing their fault, and neither is the United States. So rather than seeing the crisis as derived from Putin, we have to understand it as an ongoing process involving multiple actors, multiple reasons and causes. So, is that the last one? I think that's the last one. So, that's sort of my conclusion then. One thing that I didn't talk about is where China fits in with all of this. There's been a lot of speculation. A lot of people are saying that China is watching and trying to position itself for Taiwan, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think China is very successfully remaining neutral in this because it's allowing them to look like the benevolent power in a would-be multipolar world, right? By remaining neutral and brokering a peace agreement, if they are to do it, China looks great, right? They look like they're the responsible ones, which they are in this case, the responsible ones that are working with the warring powers to try to broker an agreement. So I don't think that China is positioning itself for Taiwan anytime soon, or even taking sides for that matter.